Hi guys, and welcome back to Is It Worth It Reviews. Today we are going to talk about one marvelous product. It's a DAC coming from Denafrips Venus 15th. Its build, like technicalities and attention to details that went into it, and finally sonics. But we'll talk about that a bit later in the video. So this is a big chunky device of almost 20 kilos. We are talking about significantly bigger and heavier Venus 15th than the Venus 12th was. And that is because this is actually, let's call it by the real name, Terminator 12th. I think it's Terminator 12.1, but I'm not fully sure, and it's not even a secret, really. Now, Denafrips developed their new flagship Terminator 15th, but they saved some R&D costs by using previous flagship Terminator 12th as current Venus 15th, and the previous Venus 12th is current Pontus 15th. Which is actually a great opportunity for us consumers that couldn't afford those highly priced DACs. So yeah, this is completely internally hardware-based, actually externally even, the last gen flagship Terminator 12th. And I'm quite excited to review it now as Venus 15th at a lower price of $4,000 US. And if you know anything about Denafrips, you already probably know that these are R2R based DACs. They do digital to analog conversion. You do not have fancy display, UI, many things to play with, and even analog outputs that can be both single-ended RCAs or balanced XLRs. Those outputs are line level fixed signal, so no volume attenuation here. You'll have to control your volume like any real audiophile should really by using a true preamplifier. But back to the DAC itself. On the digital side of things, it's very, very rich when it comes to connectivity. So we are talking about USB, optical toslink, coaxial SPDIF, then AES EBU, and then 3 I2S connections. One is over HDMI port, while other 2 are Ethernet ports. And then we also have clock outputs. One is 45, the other one 49 megahertz. So you can use Venus 15th as a clock source and synchronize anything else in your system like a digital source or DDC with this DAC, which, by the way, has the highest possible quality of an controlled crystal oscillator. It's basically a flagship grade clock like you would expect from Terminator. Venus, but X-Terminator, and everything else. If you take a look at its R2R network, it's fully balanced, made with highly precise resistors of, I think, 0.01% tolerance. And then we have powerful signal processing FPGA unit that handles like insanely high PCM and DSD resolutions. I'll put that on the screen. And then the next interesting thing, if you're not familiar with it already, is that this tall box is divided into 2 sections. The upper one is where this DA conversion, signal processing, and the output stage are, and where signal basically moves. The lower one, which is divided from the upper one by steel plate, is actually a power supply, and not just one, but 2 linear power supplies with 2 separate transformers. One is powering the analog section of the DAC, the other one the digital section of the DAC, so these 2 don't interfere with each other. And attention to details with all of that is just phenomenal. For once, the steel plate that is dividing them that I mentioned is there as a protection from electromagnetic interference. And then some other stuff that I find really interesting. For example, power inlet in the back of the unit is custom-made rhodium-plated copper. And the transformers that I've just mentioned are made of copper wire that has low percentage of silver and also gold in the mix of the material. Now that's also very interesting for me personally, because I used that kind of wire several times in my own do-it-yourself builds. And the only manufacturer in the world that I knew until now producing that kind of wire is Germany-based Mundorf. And that wire called Angelique or something like that is a really, really great wire, and I used it in several of my do-it-yourself builds, also for power cables, because it has really good sonic characteristics. Now, I'm not sure if Denafrips is sourcing this wire from Mundorf or they're making their own custom-made wire, but I like what I'm hearing material-wise. And then all other components are, of course, chose to be of a high quality, but cherry on top for me personally, because if you didn't notice, I love good high-quality wires and connectors and materials. I use them in my own builds, where I spare no expenses because it's for myself, not for mass production. So the cherry on top are wires that are connecting that power supply in the lower section to this upper DA conversion part are pure solid silver. Now that's something you don't see often in a mass-produced product. But moving on from that, you can see that in the front it's a very Spartan device, because it's a DAC only. It doesn't have volume attenuation, it doesn't have much things that you can tinker with, it doesn't have a display, it just has a row of buttons and then a row of LEDs that will show you some things that you need to know. Input selection, phase selection, NOS or OS mode selection. You can actually choose between NOS, non-oversampling, and two oversampling modes, one slow, one fast or sharp. And we'll talk about these modes and how they influence the sound a bit later. So let's actually talk about the sound. Now, the first thing that I've noticed when I started listening to Venus 15th is how big, and when I say big, I really mean humongous, how huge this DAC sounds. That means that the soundstage is really wide, but it's also really, really deep. And it just envelops my whole speakers and the space behind them and around them, and it creates probably the biggest sound stage that I've ever heard. I don't think that anything except Lampucera Baltic 3 had this big, this enveloping sound stage. And what's even more impressive is that that sound stage is not achieved by blowing everything out of proportions and having big diffused fuzzy sounds that are huge but not precise. No, inside of that huge sound stage, tones themselves are really precise. They're placed with great stability, they're rooted to the ground and to their place in the mix, with just a great amount of empty space around them and separation from other tones. And that goes both left and right and front and back. You have a clear three-dimensional sensation of where everything is. It's like you had some sort of 3D scan of the sound made by some sort of sonar, and then you reenact everything in its place precisely. But the thing is that that precision also doesn't come with leanness in any sort of way, because tones sound bold, physical, very believable, palpable and present in space. Yet they somehow have great precision and great outlining of those tones. And that sound stage is fantastically stable. It never feels stressed. It never collapses, even with the most cramped and crowded recordings. It's just fully developed, enveloping your speakers, being deep, dark, and stable, no matter what are you listening to. Now, moving away from the sound staging that is really impressive, let's talk about tonality, and let's start with the bass region. Now, the bass line has fantastic extension. It digs really deep into the sub-bass, and everything sounds so weighty and so physical that it slams like no other DAC that I've ever heard or ever tested in my own setup ever sounded like. So we are talking about really weighty, deep and physical bass line that if you have speakers that can do that, you'll feel it. And just if you're wondering, I'm not only testing with great monoacoustic Platinum speakers that can go down to 40 Hz. I also have a 12-inch subwoofer that is extended that all the way to 18 Hz flat. So it's not a problem to hear those deep sub-bass notes. And Venus 15 is doing that bass so effortlessly big, huge and powerful and deep that I think that bass lovers will be amazed with it. The thing that I like about it is, for one, when you have such a healthy core down below, it influences the rest of the sound in the most positive way. Now, everything in the mid-range also sounds very present, chesty and bold, and physically rooted in space in a way that lightweight DACs simply cannot achieve. But there is a danger with this kind of bass sometimes, because bass line is by its nature slower frequency, and it makes everything sound a bit slower, and that is true with Venus 15. But this is not, generally speaking, slow DAC by any means. The moment you start going above that sub-bass region that's really weighty and rumbly, we have great control and great precision of upper bass, mid bass, and just mid-range. So we are not talking about generally warm sound, which might be surprising. Lots of bass is often connected with, generally speaking, warm sound, but that's not the case here. No matter that weighty, full-bodied tonality, this is actually very clean and precise and pinpointing kind of DAC. And once you get to upper frequencies, everything is pristinely clean. You get both great palpability and three-dimensionality with also great precision and outlining and separation of tones. And Venus 15 sounds like that. So mid-range itself is not too prominent. It's rich sounding, full sounding, but if anything, it has slightly laid back character. The most forward thing is in the plane with your speakers. Those are vocals and leading instruments. They sound very present and physical, like embodied physically in air in between your speakers because of that full bodiness. And then things that extend further away, further back, are just going back and back and back to depths that rarely any DAC can actually achieve. And then moving to highs, there is one interesting thing. This is not a dark or rolled off or tame sounding DAC. If anything, it has prominent bright highs. But the thing is that highs are so smooth and so natural sounding that you never think that they're jarring or too forward or too edgy. And some people like to call that character time coherent, but personally I like to describe that as a liquid tone, liquid tonality. It's like tone is just gliding over ice, perfectly smooth, perfectly elegant and liquid-like. You never hear any harshness, you never hear anything that sounds matte or rough, unnatural and interrupted in any way. We have highs with great energy and great flow. If you can imagine a ringy kind of sound, any metallic or glassy kind of sound, like bells, triangle, that will sound so realistic and present with this DAC. And even more than that, when we do not have these high-frequency instruments, the soundstage width and size and just airiness and the sensation of empty space between instruments is often painted by the high-frequency extension. And these highs lend great brilliance to all tones and great airiness and openness around tones. But there is a thing about highs worth mentioning. They do depend quite heavily on the digital filter that you have chosen. So for example, in the NOS non-oversampling mode, they actually will be slightly tamer and rolled off, and then the mid-range centric tonality slightly surfaces. And you do get very rich, very natural sounding tones, but tones do become a bit more mid-range centric, a bit more matte, and also the soundstage loses a bit of that airiness and brilliance, and it collapses a bit. It's still very deep, very spacious, but not as wide and as open and airy as OS oversampling modes. When it comes to OS modes, we have sharp one or fast one, and that is the one that will sound like a really great delta sigma DAC sounds. It will increase overall precision and dynamics compared to NOS mode. It will add high-frequency extension and brilliance in tones and just more empty space between instruments and around them in a bigger soundstage. But the thing is that OS sharp mode loses a bit of tonal richness, and tones do thin out a bit. They are insanely precise and very well pinpointed, but they do sound a bit more analytical and less harmonically rich. Which leads me to the last mode, oversampling slow, my personal favorite, that sounds equally tonally rich with great inner tone texture, with great harmonic richness and mid-range. It's not as precise as fast filter, but it feels more natural, it feels fuller, but it also brings that high frequency extension with radiance, and it opens up the soundstage so everything sounds a bit bigger, more spacious and more impressive. But that's just my personal opinion and matching with the rest of my system. If you have different opinions and experiences, I would be glad to read them down below in the comments. Now, the last thing that I wanted to mention before we move to comparisons is dynamics. Now, you often hear me talking about DACs that sound lively and have great snappy microdynamics. But I also often say that when it comes to big dynamic swings, they're not the best out there. And sometimes people ask, but where are the best when it comes to big dynamic swings? And I often say, follow the power supply and output stage, not the DA conversion technology. DACs that have mighty power supplies and mighty analog stages sound mighty too. And Venus 15th is one of the mightiest sounding DAC, if not the mightiest that I've ever encountered. And because of that, even the most demanding classical music with huge dynamic swings and big orchestras and just very loud passages that go after very silent and laid back passages, that sounds great through Venus 15th. It never feels stressed. It never feels compressed. It's just doing all of those huge dynamic swings with ease and grace that you have to hear a DAC of this level to actually know what I'm talking about. But enough about the sound in isolation, let's do some comparisons. And to be perfectly honest here, comparing Venus 15th to most DACs that I reviewed on this channel would be a very one-sided fight. So I'll just choose my two best DACs so far that can actually put some decent fight against Venus 15th. And the first one is Laiv Harmony DAC that goes for $2,700 US. This one is also R2R DAC. It can also work in an NOS or OS mode, and it's a fantastic sounding DAC on its own. Now, Laiv Harmony is a warmer sounding DAC. It has warmer mid-bass and mid-range, and generally speaking, it's a more mid-range centric sounding device. It inflates the mid-range towards the listener, making vocals and instruments sound closer to you and more intimate. And those mid-range tones also sound a bit harmonically richer. I guess they called it harmony for a reason. But it's also, in that warmth, it's also a bit fuzzier and hazier and not as well defined as on Venus 15th. So those big vocals and big leading instruments and tones are a bit more blended, and separation between them and clean outlines are fuzzier. They're just a bit blurrier. Also outside of the mid-range, if we are talking about bassline is just not as deep and as grunty and weighty with Harmony Live as it is with Venus 15th. Live is a bit more lightweight sounding when it comes to that deep sub-bass. And you do not notice that on its own. It has a perfectly good, deep, big sounding bass when you listen to it in isolation, but compared to this really hammer hitting, thunderous sub-bass digging Venus 15th, it sounds a bit light-footed. But the thing is that the mid-bass and lower mid-range are warmer with Harmony, and it creates the sensation of shallower but warmer bass line. And it's a funny thing when you hear the weightier and deeper bass of Venus 15th that is also more precise and placed in the sound stage with greater precision and greater stability. It's like focused and energized and hits really deep. Harmony is a bit less focused, it's a bit more dispersed, and just warmer, bloomier. In the mid-range, as I said, very forward, very rich sounding Harmony, a bit more laid back, but cleaner and once again more precise with cleaner edges, Venus 15th. And in the highest region, highest frequencies, even if you enable oversampling mode with Harmony, Venus 15 is definitely a brighter and more technical sounding DAC. But there is also one thing that's important to say. Harmony does sound a bit grainier and grittier in higher frequencies like upper mid-range and highs, whereas Venus has that liquidy smooth, almost tube-like tonality to its highs. So even though it does sound tonally brighter, it's not by any means harsher or more jarring or more tiring, because it does have an even higher liquidity and smoothness than the Harmony here. So generally speaking, if we put all of this together, Harmony is a bit more mid-range centric, harmonically richer in the mid-range sounding DAC, but not as precise, not as clean and as defined, spatially more forward. Its bass line is also a bit shallower but a bit warmer and less defined. Venus 15th has gruntier, deeper but more precise bass line, And in the highs, the Harmony DAC sounds a bit grittier, and Venus is just more pristinely clean. Another thing is sound staging. Harmony is a huge sounding DAC on its own, but it pushes a lot of the sound staging a bit forward, more forward than Venus 15th, but not as deep behind the speakers, also not fully as wide as Venus 15th. And also when it comes to huge dynamic swings, it feels like Venus 15th is doing those swings with more ease. It has greater dynamic range. It goes from really silent to really loud with more ease, and it does stay more stable in space during those passages. So in terms of sound staging, just precision and clarity, and also dynamics, I have to give that to Venus 15th. Also, it sounds super coherent and liquidy smooth, almost like it's a tube DAC, and I also have to give that one to Venus 15th. Where you might like Harmony DAC more is when it comes to that harmonic richness and warmth. So mid-range warmth and harmonic richness, if you're all about that, you might like Harmony more. But generally speaking, I do think that Venus 15th is a better performer in this duel. Now, the latest comparison, that is not really a comparison, but just something I wanted to mention, is if you follow my channel regularly, you have maybe seen the video where I presented do-it-yourself build that I did. It's a tube DAC called Lampucera, and I learned the correct pronunciation for that DAC, Lampucera, from my Polish viewers. Thank you for that, by the way. And that build was initially designed by the man who is now owning Lampucera brand. It's a highly regarded, basically high-end brand that does tube DACs. So I put my heart and soul into that DAC, and really high quality parts and some high quality copper wiring in the power supply, pure solid silver wiring in the signal path, great capacitors, connectors and everything. And because of that, I achieved that just smoothness and coherence and liquidity that no mass-produced DAC that I've ever tested could fully match. Now, from the moment I reviewed Laiv Harmony DAC, Harmony did manage to outperform my Lampucera technically. It had more tiny detail retrieval, it had slightly bigger sound stage, and I mostly listened to it in my own system. But from time to time, I would go back to Lampucera just to hear that fantastically smooth and natural liquid sound with those liquid highs that I thought personally that you have to use tubes to achieve it. But now I'm really surprised that Denafrips is achieving that same amount of coherence and natural flow and liquidity using good old R2R design in that favorite mode of mine, oversampling slow. This DAC sounds as natural, as smooth as my own Lampucera build. But it also develops even bigger soundstage, and Lampucera has great soundstage, nothing before Laiv Harmony could actually exceed it. Denafrips Venus 15 has wider and deeper soundstage. It also has a slightly higher precision and detail retrieval than my own DAC. So you combine bigger soundstage with greater precision and pinpointing, and in the end, but also equally important, greater dynamics. Now this immensely deep, digging, punchy bass that Venus 15 has, my tube DAC is close, but it's not there. And also when it comes to these big dynamic swings, my tube DAC is once again close, but not fully there. So Venus 15th has some same qualities of my own tube DAC that I really love, but it pushes performance in several ways to an even higher tier. And the only reason that I can think of that somebody wouldn't like this DAC is its tonality. So because it has great bass mass, if you have problems and you cannot tame the bass line in your listening room, like big speakers, a lot of room mods that are emphasizing that bass, having such deep and powerful bass will only emphasize the problems in your own system and in your own room. Another thing, high frequencies that are bright and revealing and radiant. If you have a system that's already bright, that might be a bit too much. But that's more a thing of matching with the rest of your system and your listening room than it is the shortcoming of a DAC. The DAC itself, as I said, in my opinion, does so many things so great that is, at least for my own taste and in my own experience, so easy to fall in love with. And with that, it has my highest recommendation. If you're in a place that you can even think about something like this, and you have a really great system, because yeah, the rest of the system is going to play a huge role in if you are going to be able to extract and to hear all that this DAC has to offer. But objectively, I do believe that this is the highest performing DAC that I've ever tested on this channel. A clear S-tier performer. And with that, I hope you liked this video. I also hope it wasn't too long. I do get like that when I personally really engage with some product. But anyways, see you next time. Bye.